The cemetery of clocks, an ancient clock that never stops mysteriously arrives at a family's home. When they realize that each chime marks the death of someone close, they race against time to uncover the clock's sinister origins. The morning light streamed through the living room window, filtered by curtains made of worn fabric that my mother insisted on keeping, despite their faded color. It seemed like an ordinary day, or at least it appeared to be, but the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the air was waiting for something. I was sitting on the sofa, legs crossed, watching the movement of leaves outside. The wind seemed to play with them, but I had no desire to join in the fun. There was an anxiety in the pit of my stomach, an odd sensation I couldn't quite identify. "Lucas, have you decided what you're going to do today?" my mother asked, interrupting my thoughts. She was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the aroma of coffee, and for a moment, it almost made me forget the unease that lingered. "I don't know, Mom. Maybe I'll stay home and play video games," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. But the truth was that I had no desire to play anything. The idea of spending the day cooped up at home seemed as boring as it was frightening. "Oh, Lucas, you need to get out more," she exclaimed, appearing at the kitchen door with a slice of bread in hand. "How about a walk in the park? The day is beautiful. Maybe later." I didn't want to disappoint her, but the thought of going to the park didn't excite me. What I really wanted was to discover what was happening with that clock that had arrived the week before. The clock, an antique artifact that seemed to hold more stories than any of us, hung on the living room wall. Since the day it appeared, it had become the center of our attention. It wasn't just its peculiar appearance, with a face where the numbers were nearly erased and dark wood that seemed to absorb light, but also its incessant ticking. It never ceased to chime, and each toll sounded like a foreboding warning that left us uneasy. "Lucas, are you listening to me?" my mother interrupted my musings again. I looked at her, and she had a worried expression. "Sorry, Mom. I was thinking," I hesitated but couldn't help myself. "Have you noticed that the clock only chimes when something happens?" She furrowed her brow, and I could see the worry in her eyes intensifying. "What do you mean?" she asked, placing the slice of bread on the table. "Well, it seems that every time it tolls, something happens, something bad. Yesterday, it chimed, and Mrs. Maria from upstairs didn't come down for coffee. Later, we found out she was in the hospital. That's just a coincidence, Lucas. Clocks chime all the time," she began, but I interrupted her. "But it's not just that. Last week, it chimed, and your friend, Mr. Carlos, had that car accident. Isn't that strange?" She took a deep breath, and I could sense the weight of her words. "I don't like to think that way, dear. Remember, these are just rumors." The way she said it made my heart race. She was trying to protect me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was involved. I decided to get up and walk over to the clock, feeling the cold wood under my fingers. The pendulum swung slowly, and I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. "Lucas, be careful," my mother warned, but I was already too close. I examined the details of the clock. There were small carvings along the edges, images that seemed to tell stories from long ago. But what intrigued me most was how it seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. "Look at this, Mom," I called, pointing at one of the carvings. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" She came closer and looked, but her expression was one of indifference. "No, my son, it's just an old clock. Let's stop thinking about it and focus on what really matters." "But what if it's—" I hesitated, but the urgency of the situation pushed me on. "What if it's cursed?" She laughed, but the sound was tense. "Lucas, you know there are no curses. Just stories to scare children." But I wasn't so sure anymore. With each toll, each passing second, the feeling that something was about to happen intensified. I decided I couldn't just let this go. If it wasn't a curse, maybe it was a warning. "Mom, I'm going to look into this clock." I need to understand what might be happening. I spoke with determination. You're being dramatic, she exclaimed, but I could see the worry taking hold of her. I just want to find out the truth. I shouted, frustration overtaking me. I didn't want her to see just a worthless object. The clock was much more than that. Fine, if you want to do this, go ahead. But remember that life goes on, and you can't let this consume your time. She looked me in the eyes, and I realized that, in some way, she was scared too. I decided my first step would be to talk to Mr. Pedro, the neighbor who always seemed to know everything. He was a true encyclopedia of stories from the street, and perhaps he would know something about the clock's past. When I left the house, the sun was high, and the heat of the day felt heavy on my shoulders. I walked to Mr. Pedro's house, an old building with a garden he tended to with care. The smell of flowers mingled with the warm air, and I wondered if he felt the tension I was experiencing. "Hi, Lucas," he greeted me with a smile that lit up his wrinkled face. "What brings you here so early?" "Mr. Pedro, I need your help. It's about a clock that arrived at my house." I spoke, trying to keep calm, but the urgency in my voice was evident. "A clock?" he repeated, a look of curiosity crossing his face. "What's special about it?" Well, it doesn't stop chiming. And every toll seems to coincide with something bad happening." As I spoke, his expression began to shift, and I could tell he was paying attention. That's intriguing, my young man. Clocks have stories, and some carry energies beyond our understanding." He looked at me with an intense gaze, as if trying to see inside me. "Do you know anything about this?" I asked, feeling my heart race. "I've heard stories about old clocks that bring luck or misfortune. But what you describe is more serious." He stepped back slightly and looked at the sky, as if deep in thought. "Many years ago, I met a man who collected clocks. He told me that some of them carry memories of those who have passed." "What?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Is that possible?" "I believe so, Lucas. What you need to understand is that time is an illusion, and objects carry the emotions and stories of those who own them. If that clock is chiming with every toll, it may be a reminder of something or someone that needs to be resolved. But how can I find out?" My voice was low, almost a whisper. "The answer may lie within the clock itself. Try to observe the details, listen to its tolls, and who knows, you might find the connection." He smiled, but there was a shadow in his gaze, as if he was aware I might be stepping onto a dangerous path. I thanked Mr. Pedro and made my way back home, my mind filled with questions and the feeling that I was about to uncover something that would change everything. The clock was there, hanging on the wall, and I approached it again, determined to unravel its mystery. "What are you hiding?" I murmured, looking directly at the face. The hours passed slowly, but time felt like it was in a frantic race, and I needed to discover the truth before it was too late. The house was engulfed in oppressive silence, broken only by the incessant ticking of the ancient clock that had arrived unexpectedly. With each toll, my heart raced, as if the clock itself was marking the rhythm of my anxiety. I glanced at my mother, who sat at the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on the door, as if she were waiting for something or someone to come in. That morning, the atmosphere was filled with a feeling I couldn't identify, but it left me restless. "Mom, are you okay?" I asked, trying to start a conversation, but she merely shook her head, still lost in her thoughts. The clock chimed again, and I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. Hashtag. It was the third chime of the day, and the memory of the two neighbors who had passed away in recent days struck me like a nightmare. One of them was Mr. Joaquin, a friendly old man who always told me stories about his youthful adventures, and the other was Mrs. Lucia, who made the best cakes in the neighborhood. What was happening? The clock was just an object, but its presence seemed to carry a sinister weight. "I'm going to take a look outside," I said, getting up from my chair. The air felt heavy, and I needed some space. When I stepped out, I was greeted by a clear day, but the sun seemed overshadowed by a cloud of tension. I looked down the street, but everything appeared normal. The usual scene, children playing, people rushing by, as if nothing was happening. But inside me, the unease grew. "Look, Teo, I know you're worried, but I don't want you thinking about this," my mother said, appearing at the door. Her face was pale, and her gaze held a depth I couldn't comprehend. "Let's try to forget about that clock. It's just an object, it can't do any harm." "But it's not just an object, Mom," I retorted, frustrated. "Each chime means a death. We can't ignore this." She sighed, rubbing her forehead with her fingers, as if trying to push away an uncomfortable thought. "I know, dear. I'm scared too. But thinking about it will only make things worse." I returned inside, sitting back at the table. The clock stood there, imposing and silent, like a predator lurking. An idea began to form in my mind, a need to discover the origin of that object. Curiosity consumed me, while a paralyzing fear held me back. What could I do? Where could I look for answers? "Mom, what if we try to find out where it came from?" I asked, my voice hesitant. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting a mix of fear and hope. "Do you really think that would help? We have to try. We can't just sit here waiting for the next chime, as if we're puppets of a cruel fate." She nodded slowly, seeming more receptive to the idea. "Okay. We can search online and see if we find anything about that clock. But please, Teo, be careful. I don't want you getting involved in something dangerous." "I promise, Mom. I'll just research a little, nothing too intense." I grabbed my laptop and started looking for information. The clock had an antiquated look, but it wasn't very common. There were no visible markings indicating its origin, but as I typed, a wave of nostalgia hit me, reminding me of the collection of antique clocks my grandfather used to have. He always spoke about the story behind each piece as if each one were a part of his life, a memory preserved in gears and hands. "Do you remember Grandpa and the clocks he had?" I asked my mother, who had come closer to look at the screen. "I remember," she replied, a sad smile on her lips. "He was so passionate about those clocks. He always said that each one had a soul, a story. Do you think this clock could have a story too?" I inquired, still typing. "I don't know. But if it came to us in such a mysterious way, maybe we should pay more attention." The chime rang again, echoing through the house like a funeral bell. My stomach tightened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked at my mother, she appeared even paler than before. "We can't keep going like this. We need to act before it's too late," I said, trying to calm her. "Let's find out who might know more about the clock." She nodded, but her gaze was distant, as if she were battling her own demons. We decided to head to the antique shop nearby. It was a place my grandfather used to visit, and who knows, maybe the owner could provide us with some valuable information. When we arrived at the shop, the scent of old wood and the sound of the bell at the door gave me a sense of familiarity. The place was filled with curious objects, worn furniture, dusty paintings, and an array of clocks in various conditions. The owner, an elderly man with a white beard and penetrating eyes, greeted us with a friendly smile. "How can I help you?" he asked, looking at us with interest. "We found an old clock and," my mother began, but hesitated. "And it has a strange story," I finished, feeling the urgency in my words. "We want to know more about it." The man furrowed his brow, and his expression shifted from curiosity to concern. Old clocks have their own stories. However, some of them can carry a weight much greater than one might imagine. "What does your clock look like?" I described the clock to him, and his expression turned more serious. "This type of clock is known for having a connection with time and people's lives." "What you're telling me is that the chimes coincide with deaths?" "Exactly. I exclaimed, energized by his response. We need to know more about its origin. He looked down, as if reflecting on something profound. What did you find with it? Any inscriptions, any symbols? No, nothing like that, my mother replied, her voice low. It's just an ordinary clock, but it's not an ordinary clock, is it? He interrupted. Some objects have a past that should not be revealed. This clock may be linked to tragic events, or even an unfulfilled desire. What he said made my heart race. What should we do? How can we break this curse? There's no easy path, the man replied, looking at us seriously. But the first thing you must do is distance yourselves from it. Free yourselves from this object. Time should not be manipulated, and life should not be treated as a game. But, I began to protest, but he raised his hand, asking for silence. Think carefully. Sometimes, it's better to leave the past where it belongs. What do you think you will accomplish by discovering more? The truth may be more terrifying than ignorance. Those words echoed in my mind. What were we willing to sacrifice to uncover the origin of that clock? The chime sounded again, and the sound reverberated throughout the shop. The old man looked at us, his eyes wide. You should leave. Don't let time control your lives. We left the shop, the sense of urgency still pulsing in our bodies. What to do now? What did it all mean? I looked at my mother, who looked pale, and realized that even though we hadn't found answers, the weight of the decision still rested in our hands. We needed to act, but what did it mean to act? Mom, we need to decide what to do with the clock. We may have to get rid of it, I said, trying to stay calm. She agreed, but I could see that she was as lost as I was. What did it really mean to get rid of something that felt so connected to us, even in such a dark way? The chime echoed again, and this time it felt like a scream in the silence. What more could we do? The sunlight began to set, painting the sky with a deep orange that blended with the dark blue of the approaching night. I was sitting on the living room sofa, the old wall clock pulsing with its incessant ticking, although its presence was more unsettling than comforting. With each chime, a shadow seemed to settle in the room, as if the very air was charged with sinister foreboding. My mother was in the kitchen, and the smell of freshly baked cake wafted through the air, but my mind couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Did you see the clock again, son? My mother asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway, her apron dusted with flour. She smiled, but there was a concern in her eyes that she couldn't hide. I did, Mom. It chimed again, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the unease that enveloped me. How many times? She asked, moving closer, her gaze fixed on the clock. Twice, or 3 times. I'm not sure, I murmured, staring at the floor. The weight of the truth was crushing me. I knew each chime was like an alarm bell, announcing the loss of someone. We need to find out where it came from, my mother said, now with a seriousness that left no room for doubt. This isn't normal. No one just gives a clock like this to someone else. Hashtag, I nodded, but the idea of investigating the origin of the clock made me feel more anxious than relieved. What could we find? And what if the clock was truly connected to something evil? Night fell, and the room was shrouded in a dense twilight. The clock, now more visible in the weak light of the lamp, seemed almost to pulse, as if it had a life of its own. My hands trembled slightly as I watched it. Let's take a look at the things we have about the old house, I suggested, remembering that the house we lived in before had belonged to a distant relative. Maybe there's a clue in some old documents or photos. Great idea. I'll go get the boxes from the attic. You can stay here and see if there's anything else we can discover about this clock, my mom said, already heading toward the stairs. I was left alone, and the feeling of solitude grew. The ticking reverberated off the walls, and I swallowed hard, feeling fear creep inside me. I looked at the clock, and with each chime, it felt as if a distant echo answered. Why did you come to us? I murmured to the clock, as if expecting it to respond. The answer I wanted didn't come, but the next chime seemed heavier. The weight of death that loomed over us increased, and I didn't know how to cope with it. Suddenly, the kitchen door swung open, and my mom entered with a cardboard box. Look what I found. Some things from the old house, just like you suggested. She smiled, but her smile faded when she noticed the expression on my face. Are you okay? I'm just thinking, what if this clock has something to do with our family? What if it has brought something bad? I was starting to get agitated with the possibility. She sighed, placing the box beside us. That's why we need to investigate. Let's see if we can find something that helps us understand what's going on. We opened the box together, revealing some old photos, documents, and even letters yellowed with age. The images were from a time when life seemed simpler. I focused on one specific photo, where a woman smiled next to an elderly man, both radiating happiness. Mom, who are these people? I asked, holding up the photo. That's your great-grandma and great-grandpa. They lived here until the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, my mom replied, looking nostalgic. The house was passed down to us after they died. Do you think they knew anything about this clock? I asked, trying to connect the dots. I don't know, but we need to find out. Let's look at these letters, maybe there's something that can help us, she said, pulling one of the letters from the box. The letter was yellowed and had elegant handwriting. My mom began to read it aloud. Dear daughter, I hope you are well. The clock I gave you is of great value to our family, but remember, with great power comes great responsibility. Her voice trembled. Power? What kind of power? I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. I don't know, but that worries me. What did she mean? My mom continued reading the letter, and the tension grew with every word. If you hear the chimes, pay attention to what happens around you. Some things are not what they seem. This is strange. Why didn't anyone ever warn us about this before? I was starting to feel frustrated. The idea that a curse could be linked to the clock was unbearable. Maybe they wanted to protect the family. Or maybe they simply forgot. Time has a way of making people forget what really matters, she said, now deeply focused on reading. There's more here, she said, turning the letter over. It says the clock was a gift, but also a burden. Those who do not respect time will face severe consequences. The words echoed in my mind, and I glanced at the clock once more. It seemed more threatening than ever. Severe consequences, what else can we discover? We need to learn more about this clock, Mom. We need to act before it's too late. You're right, son. Let's research online too. There might be more information about its origin. A clock like that shouldn't be common, my mom said, energized by the idea. From there, the hours flew by in a whirlwind. We researched tirelessly, but the clock seemed to envelop a mystery that extended far beyond what we could imagine. For every answer we found, more questions arose. With every chime, the tension mounted, and the feeling that something sinister was lurking intensified. With each chime, time seemed to drag on. I looked at my mom, who was absorbed in the computer screen. Are you still thinking about the letter? She asked, noticing my gaze. Yes. That part about respecting time, what could it mean? Maybe we need to understand what the clock really is. This isn't just an old object, it could be something that connects our past to the present, she said, her eyes shining with newfound determination. We need to go to the old house. There might be more clues there, I suggested. The desire to unravel that mystery grew with each passing moment. I agree. Tomorrow we'll go. We can't let this consume us. We need to face it head on, my mom said, already getting up to organize things. That night was long and restless. The clock continued to chime, and I couldn't find any peace. The weight of what we were about to uncover loomed over us like a dark cloud. What awaited us in the old house? And what else did the clock have to reveal? The questions echoed in my mind, but one thing was certain: we were about to dive into an abyss of secrets that would change our lives forever. The atmosphere in the house was heavy, as if the very air was charged with anxious expectation. Ever since the clock arrived, with each chime, a new terror settled in our hearts. The last chime still echoed in my mind, reverberating like a distant lament. My family and I were sitting in the living room, the weak light from the lamp illuminating only our tense faces. I looked out the window and saw the night approaching, the sky slowly darkening. "Mom, don't you think we should get rid of this clock?" I asked, breaking the oppressive silence that surrounded us. Her expression was one of despair mixed with anger. She looked at the clock, which hung on the wall like a warden in a cell. "And how do you suggest we do that, Lucas? It's not just an object. There's something wrong with it, and I feel we need to find out what it is," my mom replied, her voice trembling. Her words echoed in my mind, and the feeling that we were trapped in a maze without an exit intensified. My brother, Pedro, was sitting on the couch, his hands clasped and his forehead furrowed. He seemed lost in thought, but I knew he felt the weight of the clock too. "Maybe we should ask Grandpa. He always knew about strange things," Pedro suggested, finally breaking the silence. The idea made sense to me, but at the same time, a chill ran down my spine, telling me that Grandpa knew much more than he was willing to share. "Do you think he'll help us?" I asked, feeling a knot form in my throat. "What if he knows something we don't want to hear?" "We need to know the truth," my mom said firmly. "I'll call him." She got up and went to the phone in the kitchen. As the kitchen door closed behind her, Pedro and I exchanged glances. We knew that no matter what Grandpa said, nothing could prepare us for what was about to come. The phone rang several times before Grandpa picked up. "Hello?" his grave voice came through the line. "All right, Grandpa, we need your help," my mom said, her voice heavy with urgency. "Something strange is happening with the clock. It seems to have an evil power." "An evil power? What are you talking about, Clara?" Grandpa sounded skeptical, but there was worry in his voice. "It chimes, and every time it does, someone close to us dies. We need to understand where it came from and how to stop it." There was a long, tense pause. "You have the clock at home?" he asked, the concern rising in his voice. "Yes, it's in the living room." "What should we do?" "Stay away from it, don't touch it." "I'll come over. We need to deal with this before it's too late." ####. The call was disconnected, and my mother left the kitchen, her face pale. "He's coming here. He said we need to stay away from the clock." Easy for him to say, but what if the next chime happens before he arrives? I said, unable to hide my fear. "We need to prepare ourselves," Pedro said, his voice tense. "Let's stick together and wait." We agreed to sit on the couch, as far from the clock as possible, but the tension was palpable. The clock, which now seemed like a living being, appeared to watch us. The silence was broken only by the incessant ticking, now echoing like a distant heartbeat. The first chime rang out. It was as if time froze for an instant. The deep sound resonated through the house, sending a chill down my spine. I looked at my mother and saw that she was frozen, her eyes wide. "No, it can't be," she whispered, as color drained from her face. "It can't be someone we know." Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The clock continued its ticking, and each chime felt like a grim warning. The second chime sounded, and despair settled over us. "Mom, we need to do something." I shouted, but the truth was that we didn't know what to do. "Let's focus. If Grandpa arrives in time, maybe he can, maybe he'll know how to break this cycle," my mother said, but the uncertainty in her voice was evident. Another chime reverberated, and panic took over me. What if there's no time? What if he can't do anything? What if it's you or Dad? I asked, my voice trembling. Pedro stood up and began pacing back and forth. We need to find a way to neutralize it. Let's search Grandpa's books, anything about curses or cursed objects. He always had books on the supernatural, Pedro suggested, his mind racing with ideas. Do you really think that will work? I asked, skeptical. But the truth was, we had no other choice. The clock continued to chime, and each sound felt like a blow to our hearts. Let's go. Quick. Pedro grabbed my hand, and we rushed to Grandpa's office. The room was filled with ancient books, and the smell of aged paper enveloped us. We began to rummage through the books, flipping through pages in search of answers. Look here. Pedro exclaimed, holding up a leather-bound book. There's something about cursed objects. He started reading aloud, while I concentrated on every word. Objects that have a tragic history or a dark past can become bearers of curses. Often, they are created by people seeking power or revenge. To break the curse, one must discover the origin of the object and perform a ritual. The third chime sounded, and the tension escalated. We're running out of time, Pedro. I yelled, my heart racing. What else does the book say? Calm down, Lucas. Let me find it. He flipped through the pages frantically. Here. To break the curse, you need an element from the object's past. We need to find out who made this clock and why. But how? We have no idea where it came from. I was on the verge of panic as the next chime seemed to draw closer. The fourth chime echoed through the house, and I couldn't hold back. Mom! What are we going to do? I can't just sit here and wait. She entered the office, her expression worried. Grandpa is on his way, but we need to act fast. Pedro, did you find anything that could help us? We're trying to uncover the origin of the clock. It seems to have a dark story, Pedro replied, his face focused on reading. We need information on the previous owner. Let's ask the neighbors, they might know something about the clock's history, my mother proposed, determined. Do you really think they'll know? I questioned, doubtful. We have no choice. It's our only hope, she replied. With that, we decided to go out, knowing that with every step, we were getting closer to the next chime. We walked down the street, the moonlight illuminating our path. The cold wind blew, and darkness seemed to swallow everything around us. The clock still resonated in our ears, and with every step, we felt the weight of time accumulating. Let's go to Mrs. Maria. She always knows the neighborhood stories, my mother suggested. She might know something about the clock, I agreed, trying to stay focused. When we arrived at Mrs. Maria's house, we knocked on the door. The kind old lady opened it, but concern quickly took over her face when she noticed our state. What happened, children? She asked, looking at us with her gentle eyes. We need your help. We found an old clock, and something is very wrong with it, my mother explained. An old clock. I've heard rumors about a cursed clock circulating around here. But that story is just a rumor, it can't be real, Mrs. Maria said, shaking her head. We're sure it's true. Each chime means the death of someone close to us. We need to know where it came from, I pleaded, despair beginning to mix with our search. Mrs. Maria furrowed her brow, deep in thought. There was a man, long ago, who died under strange circumstances. He was a watchmaker and used to make unique clocks. They say he made a clock that never stopped chiming, and shortly after his death, several tragedies occurred in the neighborhood. Do you know where he lived? My mother asked, hope rekindled. The atmosphere in the house was heavy, almost palpable. The old clock, now hanging on the wall of the living room, emitted a rhythmic and sinister sound with each chime. I couldn't understand how something so beautiful could be so terrible. The dark, polished wood of the clock reflected the weak light of the lamp, creating dancing shadows that seemed to move as if they had a life of their own. I looked at my mother, who was sitting on the couch, her eyes fixed on the clock, as if she were hypnotized. "Mom, can't you hear that?" I asked, trying to break the silence that enveloped us. She didn't respond immediately. She seemed lost in her thoughts, perhaps trying to understand what the clock really meant. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes filled with worry. "I heard it, yes. Each chime, it's like it's telling something." Her voice was trembling, almost a whisper. "What do you think it means?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. What it meant was obvious, but speaking about it made everything feel even more real. "I don't know, but..." She hesitated, as if the words were stuck in her throat. "Andre's father died 2 weeks ago. And now, with the clock here." A chill ran down my spine. My best friend's father had passed away suddenly and tragically. The thought that the clock could be connected to his death was unbearable. I needed to do something, but what? There was no way to just throw the clock away. It was already part of our lives, and with every chime, every second that passed, I felt the pressure mounting. "We need to find out where this clock came from," I declared, trying to convince myself that there was still time. "We can't leave it like this." My mother nodded slowly, her expression becoming more serious. We knew we couldn't ignore what was happening. The clock was a curse, and we were its prisoners. "Let's ask Andre. He might know something," I suggested, remembering that his father had been an antiques collector. What could we do? What could we discover? The clock was not just a decorative piece, it had a dark story that needed to be unraveled. "Yes, let's go," my mother replied, getting up from the couch. She picked up her phone and called Andre. I could see the worry on her face as she spoke with him. After a few minutes, she hung up and looked at me. "He's coming over. He said he has something important to tell us." The wait was agonizing. With each chime of the clock, my heart raced. It felt like time was running out, and I didn't know how to act. Finally, the doorbell rang, sending a shiver down my spine. The door opened, and Andre stepped in, his face pale and worried. "Hey, guys," he said, trying to smile, but the sadness in his eyes was undeniable. "Hey, Andre. Thanks for coming," I replied, gesturing for him to sit down. I could feel the weight of what we were about to discuss was immense. "What's going on?" he asked, looking at us and noticing the tension in the air. "The clock." I started, but my mother interrupted me. Hashtag, it's not an ordinary clock, Andre. It seems to have some connection to deaths. Each chime coincides with the death of someone close to us. Andre furrowed his brow, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" he asked, almost skeptically. "Look, I know it sounds crazy, but ever since it arrived, we've been hearing those chimes," I explained, trying to stay calm. "Andre's father died 2 weeks ago, and the first chime we heard was exactly on that day." He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful, and I watched him, hoping he wouldn't just dismiss what we were saying. "I don't know," he murmured, staring at the floor. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean we need to find out where this clock came from. Someone might know something," my mother said, her voice filled with urgency. Andre hesitated, and I could see he was battling his own emotions. My dad always talked about an old clock he saw at an antiques fair. He said there was something strange about it, something that wasn't right. He didn't believe in superstitions, but... He paused, as if remembering something. He said people who bought that kind of clock usually ended up having problems. The weight of his words settled like a burden over us. With each passing second, the truth became clearer, the clock was tied to something malevolent, something we couldn't ignore. "Do you know where he saw that clock?" I asked, trying to hold on to hope. Andre shook his head. "I'm not sure, but he mentioned an old shop in town. It's a place that sells second-hand items, antiques. He always said you should be careful about what you buy there." "Then we need to go to that shop," I decided, feeling the urgency becoming unbearable. We can't wait any longer. Andre nodded, but there was hesitation in his gaze. What if we don't find anything? What if the clock is already linked to something we can't change? He asked, fear evident in his voice. Then at least we'll know the truth, I replied, trying to convince him. I knew we couldn't let this uncertainty consume us. We had to act. With a nod, Andre agreed. I stood up, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. The clock's chimes echoed like a warning, heightening our sense of urgency. As soon as we stepped outside, the night was dark, and the streets were deserted. The wind blew, and the feeling that something was about to happen hung in the air. We walked in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, until we finally arrived at the shop. The door creaked as we opened it. The smell of mildew and old wood invaded our nostrils. The place was filled with ancient objects, each with its own story, but the atmosphere was oppressive. I don't know if I like this place, Andre whispered, glancing around as if expecting something or someone to appear. We need to be quick, my mother said, gripping my arm. Let's look for the clock. As we walked among the shelves, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The dim light illuminated only parts of the objects, and shadows moved behind every corner. Look, over there. Andre pointed to a shelf at the back of the store, where an old clock was displayed. It had an imposing presence, but its beauty was overshadowed by a sinister aura. We approached cautiously. The clock was identical to the one in our house. It's him. I murmured, feeling a chill in my stomach. We need to find out who brought it here, Andre said, looking at the price tag. What does it say? I asked, trying to lean in closer. He leaned down to read, and his expression turned to horror. Belonged to a family that suffered a series of tragedies. Never keep the clock in your home. With each word he spoke, my heart raced faster. We need to get out of here. I shouted, and before I could think twice, I yanked my mother and Andre out of the store, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Once we reached the sidewalk, I took a deep breath, trying to regain my composure. The clock, with its curse, had become part of our lives, and now we were closer to uncovering the truth. We need to do something about it, Andre said, his tone grave resonating among us. Yes, but what? We can't just leave it at home, I replied, knowing the answer wouldn't be easy. What if we? My mother began but stopped, hesitant. What if we destroy it? I completed, my mind racing with the idea. Andre looked at us, surprised. That's risky. What if it turns against us, he said, uncertainty in his voice. But the alternative was even more terrifying. The clock needed to be stopped, regardless. With each chime, we knew someone else could be in danger. We need to find a way to neutralize it, I proposed, and the two of them nodded silently. The clock had entered the room, bringing with it the air of ancient wood and dust, while I watched it in the living room. It stood there, imposing, with its gold details and an elegance that seemed out of place. The sound of its mechanism ticking echoed softly, as if it were alive. Each chime seemed to pause time for a brief moment, but what I didn't know was that each of those sounds heralded something horrific on the horizon. What do you think it means? I asked, breaking the silence that enveloped my family. My younger brother, Lucas, was sitting on the couch, his eyes fixated on the clock. His expression was a mix of fascination and fear. I don't know, but it seems different. He hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. Like it's waiting for something. My mother entered the room, a dish towel in hand. Her eyes were worried, but she tried to keep calm. Let's stop talking about it, kids. It's just an old clock. She stepped closer for a better look. I believe the previous owner must have taken great care of it. Look how it shines. But I couldn't take my eyes off it. There was something sinister about the way the hands moved, as if they were marking not just the time, but something more. Did you hear the chime? I raised my voice. This isn't normal, Mom. Ever since it arrived, I feel like something's wrong. It's just a clock, Anna. Dad said, coming in from the kitchen with a glass of water. He wore a skeptical expression, but his brows were furrowed, as if he too was beginning to feel uneasy. We can't let ourselves be carried away by superstition. Superstition? I challenged. With each chime, someone we know dies. First it was Mrs. Rosa, then Uncle Carlos, and now, what else is going to happen? A heavy silence filled the room, and the sound of the clock seemed to intensify, almost as if responding to my indignation. The chime resonated once more, and my heart raced. It felt as though time was running out. What more do we need to believe? Lucas asked, his voice trembling slightly. He was scared, and I couldn't blame him. The tension in the air was palpable. We need to find out the origin of this clock, I stated resolutely. There has to be some explanation. And how do you suggest we do that? My dad asked, his tone now more serious. Are we just going to go around asking people? No. We need to investigate the previous owner. I remembered when we found the clock at the house of old Mrs. Eloisa, who had passed away months ago. She always had an aura of mystery surrounding her, and I never understood why. We can find out more about her. Who knows, she might have left some kind of clue. And if it's dangerous, my mom interjected, her eyes wide. I don't want you to get involved in something that could harm you. But we're already involved. I exclaimed, with more fervor than I intended. We can't just ignore this. I'll go with you, Lucas said, standing up from the couch. There was a determination in his voice that surprised me. I can't let you go alone. And I'll go too, my dad finally spoke up, his expression showing that he was taking the matter more seriously now. If we're going to do this, we need to be cautious. The decision was made. With renewed energy, we began to outline a plan. I went to the shelf and grabbed an old notebook where we used to jot down important things. ####, let's make a list of what we know about Dona Eloisa, I suggested as I began to write. She lived alone and was always considered strange, right? Strange and reclusive, Lucas confirmed, recalling how the community talked about her. She never let anyone into her house, except to sell her herbs. And she always said she knew the secrets of time, my mother added, as if trying to piece things together. She was a wise woman, but there was something dark in the way she spoke about time, as if it were a living entity, my father reflected, his gaze distant. We need to find out more about what happened to her before she died. We made a list of questions to investigate. What had she been doing before she passed away? Had anyone seen her practicing any kind of magic? Was there any record of the clock? And how did it end up in our house? In the following days, the atmosphere in the house grew tense. The clock seemed to have a presence of its own, and with each chime, our hearts tightened. With every sound, a new worry settled in our minds. The next morning, we decided to go to Dona Eloisa's old house. It was an ancient structure, with dusty windows and a garden overtaken by weeds. The sun shone brightly, but its light couldn't dispel the feeling that something was wrong. Are you sure this is a good idea? My mother asked hesitantly as we parked the car. We need to do this, I replied, trying to sound firm. If we don't find answers, the clock will never give us peace. As soon as we got out of the car, a cold breeze swept through the air, sending chills down my spine. The smell of damp earth mixed with that of wilted flowers, and the house seemed to be watching us. Let's go, I said, taking the first step towards the door, which was ajar, as if inviting us in. The moment we stepped inside, an overwhelming silence enveloped us. The sunlight barely lit the interior, and shadows danced on the walls. The smell of mold and dust was intense, and the discomfort grew. Look, what is that? Lucas pointed to a table in the corner of the room where a small altar was set up. On it lay strange objects, dried herbs, crystal jars, and in the center, an ancient book that seemed to be coated in dust from time. "Let's take a look," I said, approaching the altar cautiously. My heart raced, and curiosity pushed me forward. When I opened the book, the pages were filled with careful handwriting, recipes, rituals, and on some pages, drawings of clocks. "What are you seeing?" my father asked, stepping closer. "She was talking about manipulating time," I exclaimed, my voice filled with both excitement and fear. "Look at this. And if she really made some sort of pact?" Lucas whispered, his face pale. "I don't know, but we need to read more," I replied, quickly flipping through the pages. There was something there we couldn't ignore. Suddenly, a noise echoed through the house, a sound reminiscent of a chime. The clock we left at home seemed to be manifesting, calling us back. "We need to go," my mother shouted, pulling my arm. "This isn't safe." But before we could leave, I felt an intense cold. The sensation of being watched was nearly unbearable. "Anna," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. "What's happening?" With each heartbeat, reality around us felt distorted. The clock, the house, Dona Eloisa, everything intertwined in a fate we couldn't comprehend. "We need to uncover the truth," I declared, resolute, but doubt began creeping into my mind. And as the clock continued to chime, the certainty that time was running out became increasingly real. The house was shrouded in a sepulchral silence, broken only by the incessant ticking of the old clock that now dominated our home. With each chime, my heart raced, and a sense of dread consumed me. I wondered if what everyone said about the clock was true. If indeed each chime was linked to a death, not just in our small town but in our lives. That afternoon, I sat in the living room, staring at the clock, which now resembled a monster, a beast patiently waiting to devour one of us. My brother, Lucas, entered the room, a worried expression on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "No. I'm not okay," I replied, not taking my eyes off the clock. "This clock, it's not normal. With every chime, I feel something terrible is about to happen." Lucas stepped closer, eyeing the object as if it were a ghost. "I think we need to get rid of it. We can't keep this here." "What do Mom and Dad think?" "They're so caught up in what happened with Aunt Helena that they haven't even noticed what this clock is doing to us," I said, my voice choked. "We need to act before it's too late." "But how? It's just a clock. Can we even throw it away?" Lucas seemed lost in thought. He had always been more cautious than me, but there was something in his gaze showing he was starting to believe in the clock's curse too. "Let's try to find out where it came from. Someone must know the story behind it," I suggested, standing up from the sofa. "Maybe we'll find a clue. Who knows if what happened to Aunt Helena wasn't an accident but something related to this." Lucas agreed, though he looked unsettled. "Okay, but what if we're just being superstitious? What if there's nothing wrong? And what if there is?" I retorted, my frustration rising. "And if the next chime marks the death of someone in our family? We can't take that risk." We decided that before anything else, we should talk to our neighbor, Dona Agata. She always seemed to know everything about everyone, and who knows, maybe she could provide us with some information about the clock's origin. We crossed the yard and knocked on her door. The sound echoed in the silent afternoon air. Dona Agata had always been a woman of many stories, and I hoped she might have some helpful knowledge. "Who is it?" Her voice came from the other side of the door, a bit hesitant, as if she were suspicious. "It's me, Lucas, and my brother, Felipe," I said, trying to sound as friendly as possible. "Can we come in? We need your help." The door opened, and Dona Agata appeared, her expression curious. "Oh, boys. What brings you here? You look so pale. Did something happen?" "It's about the clock we found," Lucas began, but I interrupted him. "Actually, it's about Aunt Helena. Do you remember her? I asked, knowing that Dona Agata had a close relationship with our aunt. Of course. Poor thing was so ill in her last months. But what does that have to do with the clock? Dona Agata frowned, confused. We told her about the connection between the clock and the deaths that had occurred in our lives, the first being Aunt Helena's. Dona Agata listened intently, her expression becoming increasingly serious. Do you really believe the clock is the cause of this? She asked in a low voice. That sounds like superstition. But what if it's true? I insisted. What do you know about it? Do you know anyone who ever had a clock like this? Dona Agata hesitated, looking down as if weighing her words. Many years ago, a man came to town. He was a watchmaker, but not like the others. He had a reputation for making clocks that brought luck, but also misfortune. No one knew for sure how, but those who bought his clocks, well, many of them were never seen again. And what happened to that man? Lucas asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. He disappeared, just like many who bought his clocks. Rumors say he made a pact with dark forces. Since then, the clocks he made are considered cursed. Dona Agata finished, looking directly at us now. A chill ran down my spine. What if this clock is one of them? I murmured, recalling the next chime that was about to come. We need to get rid of it, Lucas said, his voice steady. We can't let it cause more harm. But what if it's very powerful? What if we try and something worse happens? Hashtag, Dona Agata questioned, worried. We have to try. We can't just stand still. I insisted. If he is truly cursed, the only way to break this curse is to get rid of him. Dona Agata looked at us, her eyes filled with concern, but there was also a determination there. If you are both decided, I will help you. But we need to be careful. Thank you, Dona Agata, Lucas said, a bit relieved. We'll do this together. We returned home, the atmosphere heavy and tense. I felt we were getting involved in something much bigger than ourselves, but there was no turning back. With each chime of the clock, fear grew, and the sensation that we were racing against time intensified. When we arrived home, the clock chimed again. The sound reverberated through the walls, and I felt as if I were in a horror movie, where the background music announces the tragedy about to unfold. The clock seemed to mock us, as if it knew we were planning something against it. We should do this now, I said, looking at Lucas, who was pale and nervous. We need to act before it's too late. Okay. Let's grab the clock and take it to the backyard, Lucas agreed, his voice trembling. We went to the living room, and the clock stood there, motionless, yet its presence was oppressive. Carefully, we placed our hands on it. The weight of the object seemed to increase with each second. Let's hurry, before it chimes again, I said, starting to move the clock. Lucas helped me, and together we managed to carry it to the backyard. Once outside, I looked at the clock, which now seemed like a prisoner awaiting its sentence. What should we do with it? I asked. Maybe we should burn it, Lucas suggested, his gaze determined. That might break the curse. And what if it explodes or something? I questioned. We need a way to destroy it without taking risks. Dona Agata appeared in the backyard, bringing a shovel and a bucket of water. I brought this. The water can help extinguish any flames that get out of control. Thank you, Dona Agata, Lucas said, grabbing the shovel. Let's dig a hole to bury it. We dug a hole in the ground while the clock stared at us. With each strike of the shovel, it felt like the earth responded with a murmur, as if the very soil was aware of what we were about to do. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel my heart racing. Finally, after a few minutes, the hole was ready. We placed the clock inside, and the sense of freedom was almost palpable. Now, let's cover it up, I said, as we began to throw soil over the clock. Dona Agata watched, her worried gaze also relieved. I hope this works. That you can finally free yourselves from this curse. Lucas and I finished covering the clock, and a sense of peace began to settle within me. We're free, I declared, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. But then, a new chime echoed through the air. The sound reverberated in our ears, and a feeling of terror gripped us. What does this mean? Lucas asked, his voice trembling. I don't know, I replied, my heart racing again. But we have to run. And so, the race against time began. The darkness of the night seemed thicker that night, as if shadows were uniting to form a shroud of despair around the house. I felt suffocated, trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end, as the old clock continued to mark time relentlessly. Each chime echoed in my ears like a harbinger of death, and the tension in the atmosphere was palpable. That night, after the last chime, the air was thick with a sepulchral silence. I looked at the living room, where the clock hung on the wall, its shiny face reflecting the weak light of the lamp. It seemed to be grinning at me, a wicked smile that only I could see. You're still here, I murmured, as the words escaped my mouth like a desperate whisper. You shouldn't be so close to it, my mother said, entering the room with a pale face. I can't stop thinking about what happened to Uncle Joao. The last chime, it was so horrible. She sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. I know, Mom. But we need to understand what's happening, I replied, trying to hide my own fear. We need to find out where this clock came from. It can't just be a coincidence. But what if it is? What if it's something we can't control? Her expression was pure terror, and I could feel the tension rising between us. The clock seemed to revel in our despair, growing heavier with each second that passed. I don't know, but we can't give up. We have to investigate. Maybe we can find someone who knows more about this. My voice was steady, but inside I was falling apart, struggling against the feeling that we were nothing but puppets in a cruel game. I heard some things in the neighborhood, my mom said, lifting her head. There's a woman, Dona Clara, who talks about strange things. She might know something about this clock. Dona Clara? The one who lives alone in the old house by the park? I asked, recalling the stories that circulated about her. They said she had a gift for seeing the future, but also that she had a dark past. Yes, exactly. We can go there tomorrow. It's better than sitting here waiting for the clock to chime again. The determination in my mother's voice gave me a bit of hope, but uncertainty still weighed heavily on us. The night dragged on, and I couldn't sleep. The sound of the clock marking the hours echoed in my mind, and with each chime, I counted the people we had already lost. Uncle Joao, neighbor Dona Rita, and now there were rumors that a friend's grandmother was ill. Could the clock be responsible for all this? The thought left me anguished. When morning finally came, the day was overcast, as if the sky were crying. I believed the weather reflected my state of mind. My mother and I decided to visit Dona Clara's house. The path was long, surrounded by trees that seemed to whisper secrets. With each step, my heart raced, and fear became almost tangible. Are you nervous? My mother asked, trying to break the silence. A little, I confessed, biting my lip. And you? I'm worried. What if she doesn't know anything? What if she tells us something we don't want to hear? She looked at me, her eyes filled with dread. We need to know, Mom. We can't live like this, with that clock threatening us every moment. I knew I had to be strong, even though I was terrified inside. Finally, we reached Dona Clara's house. It looked older than I remembered, with dusty windows and a garden full of weeds. I knocked on the door hesitantly, and soon I heard footsteps from the other side. The door opened, revealing a woman with gray hair and penetrating eyes. What do you want? Her voice was raspy, but there was kindness in her gaze. Hi, Dona Clara. We're from the Silva family. We heard that you know about strange things, and we need help, my mother said, trying to convey confidence. She looked us over for a moment, evaluating. "Come in," she finally said, opening the door a bit wider. "I can feel that you're carrying a weight." We entered the house, which was filled with old objects and a dense atmosphere. The smell of dried herbs and incense lingered in the air. "Please, sit down," Dona Clara said, pointing to a table covered with books and jars. "We have a clock," I began, but she interrupted me. "I know. It came to you unexpectedly, didn't it?" Her voice had a tone of wisdom that intrigued me. "Yes, and each chime seems to mark the death of someone close to us," I explained, feeling the knot in my throat tighten even more. "This clock is cursed. It was made by someone who wanted to play with time, but the price to pay is high," she said, her eyes drifting off to a distant point. "Cursed? What do you mean?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. "It is not just an object. It is a gateway to what lies beyond. Each chime takes a life, and the shadow of its creator extends over it." Dona Clara seemed distant, as if she were reliving painful memories. "Who did this? How can we stop it?" I didn't want to believe what I was hearing, but something inside me knew she was right. "It is not easy. The clock needs to be confronted. ####, you must discover who created it and why. Only then can you break the curse." She leaned forward, her intense gaze fixed on us. "But be careful. Those who play with time are not easy to confront." A shiver ran down my spine. "And what if we can't?" My voice came out almost as a whisper. "Then you will live with the weight of the lives that have been lost, and the clock will continue to chime, bringing more misfortune." Dona Clara leaned back in her chair, as if the gravity of her words had worn her out. "We need to know more. Any clues, anything that can help us find this person," my mother insisted, determined. "There are legends about a watchmaker who lived nearby many years ago. He was known for his magnificent creations, but also for his dark experiments. If you go after him, you might find answers." Dona Clara looked at us, her eyes filled with concern. "But remember, what you seek may be more dangerous than you imagine." "Thank you, Dona Clara. We will search for him," I replied, resolute. "We can't let more people die because of that clock." We left the house with our minds swirling with questions and a heavy weight in our hearts. With each step we took back home, reality became clearer. The clock was not just an object. It was a trap, and we were ensnared in it. "Do you really think we should seek out this watchmaker?" my mother asked as we walked. "Yes, we need to uncover the truth. If he really exists, he might be our only chance to stop this." The thought of confronting the creator of the clock made me anxious, but there was no choice. "Then let's prepare. We need to learn everything we can," my mother said, and I nodded, determined to face whatever lay ahead. Time was running out, and with every chime of the clock, it cruelly reminded us of that. As we walked, I felt a sense that something was about to happen. The clock was still at home, and with each step, I felt its call, almost as if it were pulling me back into its dark influence. What else could that clock reveal to us? And what would we do when we finally found the watchmaker? The future was uncertain, and time was slipping away. The clock's chimes echoed through the house, reverberating in every corner like cries of alarm, but to me, they were more than that, they were omens of disaster. I stood in the living room, watching the old wooden piece with its exposed gears, as if it were alive, as if it were watching me back. The weight of the clock's presence was almost tangible, and with each chime, my heart raced, a macabre symphony keeping me on edge. "Are you still thinking about it?" asked my brother, Lucas, interrupting my thoughts. He was sitting on the couch, staring intently at his phone screen, but I knew his mind was elsewhere. He was trying to distract himself, but the clock wouldn't let any of us forget the terrible truth hidden behind its enigmatic beauty. "How can I not think about it?" I replied, trying to keep calm, even though my voice trembled. "With every chime, someone dies. It's as if time is telling us we have no control over what happens. But we can't let that consume us, Lucas insisted, standing up and walking towards me. We need to find a way to get rid of that clock. This can't go on. And what if that's impossible? I asked, looking at him with despair. What if we are simply doomed to hear those chimes until it's our turn? Stop thinking like that. He stared at me, his eyes full of determination. We have to act. We can't just stand by waiting for the next blow. I knew he was right, but the idea of taking action, of confronting something that felt so supernatural, left me paralyzed. The clock, with its shiny yet worn surface, seemed to have a mind of its own, and with each passing day, I felt it becoming more and more a part of our lives. It was as if we were trapped in a vicious cycle, and the only way out was to uncover the origin of that cursed object. We need to ask Grandma about this, I suggested, remembering how she always talked about family stories. She knows the history of the clock, if it really belongs to us. Lucas nodded, although his face was still marked by concern. Let's go then. We don't have time to lose. We headed to the kitchen, where Grandma was sitting at the table, crocheting. She looked up at us with a gentle smile, but soon noticed the tension in our faces. What happened, my dears? She asked, putting the needle aside. You look scared. Grandma, we need to talk about the clock in the living room, I began, hesitantly but determined. Do you know anything about it? She frowned and looked aside, as if trying to recall something forgotten. Ah, that clock. She started, her soft voice trailing off into memories. It belonged to your great-grandfather. A very hard-working man, but he had a dark side. Dark? Lucas interrupted, his eyes wide. What do you mean by that? The story goes that he made a pact to gain wealth and success. But like every bargain with the supernatural, there was a price to pay, Grandma explained, her voice now lower, as if she feared being overheard. The clock was created to mark the moments of death for those close to him, a way to remind that time is finite and life has a cost. Is that serious? I said, feeling a chill run down my spine. What do you mean it marks the deaths? They say each chime is a countdown. When the clock chimes, someone is about to depart, she said, and her gaze fixed on me as if she could see the terror I was feeling. The only way to break the curse is to return the clock to its place of origin and ask for forgiveness. And where would that be? Lucas asked, almost breathless. In the old family mansion, where your great-grandfather lived. But it is not an easy place to reach. The mansion has been abandoned for years, and they say it is haunted, she added, looking at us seriously. The thought of going to the mansion made me anxious. I knew we had to do it, but fear settled in my chest. And what if we can't? What if the clock gets us before we can do anything? We have to try, my dear, Grandma said gently, standing up and placing her hand on my shoulder. We can't let fear dominate us. With renewed determination, we decided we would go to the mansion that very night. The sky was dark and covered in clouds, as if the universe was conspiring to make us even more nervous. When we reached the entrance of the mansion, a chill ran down my spine. The house was in ruins, windows broken, and doors creaking as if they were complaining about our presence. Are we ready for this? Lucas asked, running a hand through his hair as if trying to calm himself. We have to be, I replied, trying to mask my own fear. It's now or never. We entered the mansion, and the air was heavy, as if it carried the weight of time. The floor creaked beneath our feet, and each step seemed to echo in an oppressive silence. The walls were covered in dust and cobwebs, and the moonlight illuminated the furniture draped in white sheets, like ghosts from a forgotten past. Grandma said the clock should be somewhere here, I murmured, looking around. We need to find the place where it was kept. The main room was vast, with a huge fireplace that seemed to have been the heart of the house. I scanned the walls, trying to find any clue that might guide us. There! I shouted, pointing to an old portrait on the wall. It was a painting of my great-grandfather, standing next to a grandfather clock very similar to the one we had at home. "Maybe the clock is near the portrait," Lucas suggested, and we both walked toward the wall, our hearts racing. As we got closer, we felt an intense chill, as if the house were alive and not very pleased with our presence. "This is strange," Lucas whispered, looking around as if expecting something or someone to appear. "Let's search," I said, determined not to let fear take over. With every piece of furniture we moved, every curtain we lifted, a feeling of despair grew stronger. The clock was here somewhere, and we needed to find it before it was too late. Hashtag. Finally, we found a hidden door behind a bookshelf. "Here it is. Let's go in," Lucas exclaimed, pushing the door open. The smell of mold and decay filled our nostrils, and the darkness felt like it was swallowing us whole. Inside, there was a small room with an altar at its center. And there, on the altar, was the clock. It was even more impressive up close, with intricate details and a shine that defied the darkness around us. "It's him," I whispered, stepping closer. My heart raced in my chest, and with every step I took, I felt as if I was getting closer to the destiny that awaited us. But at the same time, fear grew within me, a realization that we were dealing with something much greater than ourselves. Lucas approached and, with trembling hands, touched the clock. "What do we do now?" he asked, looking at me with a mix of hope and despair. "We need to ask for forgiveness," I replied, closing my eyes and trying to gather my courage. "We need to ask for the curse to be broken." "Let's do it together," he said, taking my hand. 1, 2, 3. And together, we began to ask for forgiveness. The sound of the clock echoed through the house, like a distant, persistent lament, marking time with an unsettling precision. Ever since that strange object appeared in our living room, the atmosphere had changed. With each chime, I felt a chill run down my spine, a sensation that something dark was drawing near. The clock, with its dusty face and endlessly dancing hands, seemed to have a will of its own, and I wondered if it could truly be just an artifact from the past or if something more sinister lurked behind its incessant ticking. That night, as the sky darkened with storm clouds and the tempest approached, I sat on the couch, my trembling hands clutching a cup of tea. My brother, Lucas, sat beside me, his expression worried. He had always been the more skeptical one in the family, but even he couldn't ignore the aura of terror emanating from the clock. "Have you thought that maybe we should get rid of it?" I suggested, breaking the heavy silence that hung between us. I preferred not to talk about what was happening, but the tension was unbearable. "And how are we going to do that?" Lucas replied, staring intently at the clock that seemed to pulse with its own energy. "We can't just throw it away. Someone might have put this here for a reason, and we won't find out what that is if we don't investigate." "Investigate?" I laughed nervously. "You mean risk ourselves? Look what happened to Aunt Selma. With every chime, someone is dying." "I know, but if we do nothing, who will be next?" He had a point, and I couldn't dismiss it. With every chime, uncertainty grew. Whatever that clock was, it was no ordinary object. The sound of rain began to beat against the windows, creating a symphony of despair. I looked at the clock, which was now silent, but its presence was oppressive. What did it want from us? What did it represent, beyond death and pain? "Let's go to the attic," Lucas suggested, suddenly standing up. "Maybe there's something up there that can help us understand this. Some record, a clue about the origin of the clock." I hesitated, but the determination in Lucas's eyes was contagious. He had always been my protector, and if he thought this was something we should do, I couldn't refuse. "Fine. But if something happens, I want you to know that I warned you." He smiled, and the tension between us eased a bit. "You've always had a vivid imagination. Let's go." We climbed the creaky stairs, each step echoing like a harbinger of something terrible. The attic was a place we rarely visited, filled with dusty boxes and forgotten objects. The weak light of a hanging lamp swayed, casting shadows that seemed to dance around us, as if the very attic were alive. Have you ever wondered why we never touched these things? Lucas murmured as we began to open the boxes. It's like we've been avoiding something. Maybe because we always knew there were things we shouldn't touch, I replied, trying to ignore the shiver running up my spine. We spent some time rummaging through the boxes until one caught Lucas's attention. He pulled out an old diary, its yellowed pages nearly disintegrating at the touch. Look at this, he said, carefully opening the diary. The musty smell of aged paper was almost unbearable, but curiosity consumed me. Lucas began reading aloud. It was on a stormy night when I found the clock at a friend's house. She told me it carries a curse, that each chime marks the death of a loved one. My heart raced. Those words seemed to echo our own experiences. What more could be in there? Keep going, I urged, almost breathless. It says here that the clock has been passed down from generation to generation, always bringing tragedy. My God, if we had known this before, we would have never accepted this evil object. Lucas closed the diary with a thud, his expression of horror reflecting the magnitude of what we had just discovered. We need to get rid of it. Now! I exclaimed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. We couldn't let more lives be taken by the curse. Yes, but how? We can't just throw it away. We need to break the curse, Lucas said, his mind racing. I think the answer is in the diary. Let's look more closely. He began leafing through the pages again, his eyes darting desperately as he searched for any mention of a way to rid ourselves of the clock. I watched him, a whirlwind of emotions forming in my chest. Fear, anguish, but also a growing determination. Ah, here! Lucas exclaimed, pointing to a passage that appeared clearer. It says that to break the curse, we need to return the clock to the place it came from. And that means finding our grandmother's friend's house. And where is that house? I asked, anxious. I don't know, but we should ask Mom. She might know where Grandma lived in her youth, he said, closing the diary and tucking it under his arm. We hurried back downstairs, where our mom was in the kitchen, preparing something for dinner. The smell of food filled the air, but I could feel nothing but the urgency consuming me. Mom! Lucas called, interrupting her. Do you know where Grandma lived when she was young? She turned to us, surprised. Why are you asking that? Is something wrong? It's serious, Mom. We need to know. It's about a clock we found, Lucas said, his voice filled with desperation. She frowned, hesitating. I think she lived in a small town called Vila das Flores. Why? Grandma found the clock at a friend's house, and we need to return it. It's bringing death to our family, I explained, feeling the pressure rise in my chest. She looked at us, concern growing on her face. What do you mean by death? What happened? We don't have time to explain everything now, but we need to go to Vila das Flores. With every chime, someone is dying, Lucas said, his voice trembling. All right, if that's the case, let's go. We need to act fast, she agreed, her expression determined. As we prepared for the trip, the clock in the living room seemed to watch everything as if it were aware that we were about to confront its evil power. I felt a mix of fear and hope. We were about to enter a battle against something we didn't fully understand, but we knew we couldn't let the curse continue to spread. As soon as we got into the car and drove toward the town, a sense of relief mixed with anxiety washed over me. We were doing something. We were fighting against the darkness that threatened to consume us. The road ahead was uncertain, but together, as a family, we were stronger. And I knew that no matter what happened, we wouldn't let that curse define us. The road stretched before us, and I could feel that with every mile we passed, we were closer to uncovering the truth about the clock and what it truly meant for our lives. And with that, a new determination formed in my heart. We were going to end this, no matter the cost.